previous 2 episodes, I showed you late one night whilst I was on Facebook how I found an abandoned yacht in a marina in Malaysia. Sadly, the owner, a Swedish sailor named Henrik, had passed away some time before. I then went through a nightmare few weeks trying to track down papers whilst also learning about how I could possibly transport and import an unregistered and uninsured yacht before giving up on bringing her to Australia. I had just booked a haul out and surveyor to come and inspect the yacht and was now on my way from freezing Metang in southeast Australia to tropical Malaysia to have a closer look at it myself before the surveyor arrived. Okay, here's what I don't get about airports. There's about 250 people sitting down there. Our plane was delayed for about an hour and 45 minutes. And just over here is all of that. Prior to leaving Australia, I had arranged covers to be put over Valkyrie's decks to stop any further water ingress and arranged a haul out and independent survey report in Port Dickson. All of this was set for a few days after I arrived. I had also brushed up on the components and parts of a 2001 Bavaria 40 Ocean and learnt what I could about what to look out for during my own pre-survey inspection. Probably a wise move. I arrived in Kuala Lumpur and it was bloody hot, like crazy hot. I'd been to Cairns in far north Queensland in the middle of the wet season, but this was next level, especially for someone from southeastern Victoria coming from 7 degrees. That's 45 degrees for our Fahrenheit friends. Out of the airport and in the sun and the humidity, I couldn't even think. I immediately thought of the words of Brian from SV Delos, who said on more than a few occasions that yacht ownership just means working on boats in searing hot locations. But it wasn't until I set foot in sweltering Malaysia that this really hit home. The 90-minute trip from Kuala Lumpur to Port Dickson was made better by Mohammed, the complete legend taxi driver, who found an Aussie rock playlist to put on the taxi sound system. By now, I had to admit to myself that I was a little in love with the idea of this boat, and very taken in by her story. I checked in with the smiling and very pregnant receptionist at the hotel and dropped my things at my $10 per night hotel room. I then immediately started walking the short distance to the marina. As I arrived at the marina, I spotted Valkyrie in the distance. I knew exactly where to look from the numerous photos and videos I'd been looking at. I checked in at the marina office and the manager said it was okay to go down to Valkyrie myself and motioned me in the right direction, saying I could go alone and that she didn't need to be with me. It looked as though she wanted nothing to do with that boat or me and was prepared to let a complete stranger go on board without supervision, which I thought was a little bit odd. A bit dizzy from the overwhelming heat and humidity, I made my way down the ramp to the docks. As I got closer to Valkyrie, I took a deep breath and a feeling of a type of happiness mixed with anxiety started to run through me. Wow, I thought, she's way bigger and looks way better in person. As I walked up to her, I glanced down at the water and stopped.
That is not a good sign.
I noticed a rainbow-coloured film shining in the sun and floating on the water around her. Could this be oil? Or maybe it's just some kind of soap, perhaps? I immediately wondered if it could be coming from the sail drive, or if maybe they had cleaned Valkyrie ahead of my arrival. My excitement and happy thoughts then began to get replaced by honest critique. In just a few seconds, a stack of thoughts entered my head. 2 years had probably taken its toll, I thought. I wondered if the sacrificial anodes were all gone and if electrolysis had compromised the sail drive, letting out gear oil. I walked around her, and just before I boarded, Henrik entered my mind. In my head, I politely asked his permission to board, still respectful that I was on another man's boat. I first stepped into the cockpit and tried to turn the wheel on the helm, checking that no autopilot or lock was in place, but it was jammed solid. After a quick scan of the cockpit to make sure all of the electronics were there, I made my way to the open companionway, looked in and noticed that the door to the engine bay had collapsed since the photos were taken just a few weeks earlier. It was rotten to the core, and because the entry steps were supported by this door, they were now leaning precariously on the unsupported sidewall instead. Getting in I could probably handle, but getting out might be a bit difficult. I continued anyway. Now, I can't really explain what happened next, but I'll just say this. I don't believe in hocus pocus, superstitions, ghost stories, and any other type of gobbledygook. I'm generally pretty pragmatic and consider myself a reason-based critical thinker. Now that you know that about me, this is what happened next. As I lowered myself into the main cabin, I noticed that the interior had been given a pretty good clean. I was, to be honest, a little annoyed at this, as I had specifically asked that this did not happen. My reasoning was that I wanted the boat to look as dilapidated as possible, so that if I did decide to import it to Australia, Border Force's inspection might result in a lower price for the market valuation, therefore lowering my import tax costs by possibly tens of thousands of dollars. The other thing I noticed when I entered Valkyrie was that the temperature inside was nice and chilly, which in 40 degree plus heat and off the scale humidity, or 104 degree plus heat for our Fahrenheit using friends, was an enormous relief. But in no time at all, it was so chilly down there that it was almost unbearably cold, and the air seemed very thin, like when you're at altitude on a snowy mountain. I shrugged it off, thinking that whoever had cleaned the boat must have had the air conditioners on maximum level, and they must have just left. Good timing, I thought. People having just been here cleaning the boat could also explain the rainbow colour in the water, as this was most likely some sort of soap which hadn't dissipated yet. I continued on exploring the boat. The whole time I was in there, I also felt like I was being watched. I actually checked numerous times, poking my head out through the companionway to see if anyone else had boarded or was standing next to Valkyrie on the dock to keep an eye on me, but nobody was ever there. I also looked to see if there were security cameras, but there were none. It was an eerie feeling, but I thought maybe it's just the air conditioning making me a bit chilly. It could have also been the fact that I was in a deceased person's boat, which was also his home at one point, and rummaging around in his things. It was completely plausible that this could be making me feel uneasy, but I just got this distinct feeling that I shouldn't be there. At this point, I'll just shut up for a bit and let you watch and listen. After looking around for about 15 minutes, I knew that the drivetrain, consisting of the motor and sail drive, would either need to be completely removed and refurbished or replaced. But even with that expense, $9,000 was still a very cheap price for this boat. And if I were to refurbish the motor and sail drive, I would then have learnt about those two vital components and what makes them tick, and that would be valuable knowledge going forward. I also estimated that around 80% of the timber would need to be replaced, but that could be done very economically in Thailand or Malaysia, so I really believed I was still on a winner. After exploring the interior a little further, I then climbed up the steps and sat in the cockpit for a while to enjoy the chilly air and think things over. Before me lay a person's lost dream. Poignant thoughts shot off in various directions, some terribly sad, some saying that this boat had at least once been the focal point of much joy and had served her purpose well to her loving owner as he lived out his adventures and sailing dreams. Then, as I sat there, the steps which I already knew were loose and somehow had not collapsed as I exited, fell with a thud. I stood up over the companionway and looked into the cabin. That was a close one. Then a thought occurred to me. How was it still cold in the cockpit? And at that moment, the penny dropped. If the motor and therefore the air conditioners were in absolutely no state to run, how was it that Valkyrie was so cold, even in the cockpit? A wave of something like adrenaline ran through me in a second. I stood up, pulled the bimini clears aside and got out of the yacht in two very quick large steps. I didn't jump, okay? I just moved quick. My haste and momentum almost took me straight across the floating dock, and if it wasn't for the boat on the other side, I would have gone straight into the water. I didn't know what to think. I just looked back at Valkyrie, who was still making small ripples in the water, from me stepping off, no doubt. Not jumping. Then to make things even weirder, right at that moment, these two arrived. I instantly knew what they were. Corpus corax, common raven, rare in these parts. Want to know how I knew?
Say hello, Tinky.
Pleasure, Tinky. Corvus corax, common raven, smartest of all birds. Rare these parts.
But back to this story. I also knew that the symbolism of a black raven wasn't good, but I googled just to be sure. Now, like I said earlier, I don't believe in gobbledygook, but this was starting to get a little spooky and by now making me feel a bit uneasy. Not wanting to be irrational, in my head I rationally justified what I was about to do by telling myself, it might just be too hot for me to work in these conditions. I then immediately called Sharfie, the crane company and the surveyor and cancelled everything. I was out. I went back to the hotel, gave most of the tools and equipment I had bought to the lovely pregnant receptionist and said she could keep it or sell it or buy a present for herself and her baby, said goodbye and then packed my bag and ordered a taxi. The taxi was going to take an hour, so as I waited I went across the road for a swim at the beach to decompress. An hour later, as I left Port Dickson, I felt a bit dejected. Enrique was still on my mind, as was my own mortality. So I reminded myself that I was actually quite lucky to be here at all and to just enjoy the ride. I caught one last glimpse of Valkyrie as the taxi drove me out of Port Dickson, and I also wondered if perhaps something or someone was trying to tell me something. A little while later, after events on the other side of the world, I was almost certain that something or someone was. But I'll go into that story in more detail in a future episode for my subscribers. Update! The day after I left Port Dickson, Valkyrie was sold to a marine engineer based in Malaysia who had been waiting on me to pass her up. I'd had a chat to him to pass on what documents and info I'd found, and he was grateful. She will sail again, which is a great thing. I just hope he can sort out that phantom air conditioning and bird problem. In any case, this was probably the best outcome for Enrique's very much loved yacht, and she would stay in Malaysia. I definitely think that Valkyrie got who Valkyrie needed and what Valkyrie wanted. And not me, of course, but someone spiritual might say that maybe that wasn't an accident. What do you think?